Hi everyone, and welcome to the webinar on HIV, gender-based violence, and the policy environment. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I'm Shayna Buehler, Senior Program Officer with the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development, and I'm here with Kate Alexander, ICAD's Public Engagement and Membership Officer. I'd like to welcome and thank our speakers on the phone, Akan-Essien, I don't know if I've got that.
Perfect.
A Community Development Coordinator with the AIDS Committee of Ottawa, and Stéphanie Claivaz-Loranger, a Senior Policy Analyst at the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. Unfortunately, our third presenter, Neti Musan, the Director of Musan,
The opening, huh?
Okay, Eric. Not been able to join us this morning as she was called away on some urgent work and didn't have the technological capacities to join us where she is. What we will try to do is get a recording of her presentation, and if that works out, then we'll make sure to send you all the link to that recording so that you can hear her presentation. Just a few housekeeping details before we begin. We are not able to do a universal mute, so star 6 to mute your line to minimize background noise, and then you can press star 6 to unmute. You can also use the chat function on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you want to ask any questions that way or have any comments. And just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the link with you afterwards. We've organized this webinar on HIV, gender-based violence, and the policy environment in recognition of International Women's Day, and as the international community prepares for the 59th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. There's much work being done to influence global initiatives such as the CSW and the post-2015 development framework to ensure that gender-based violence, HIV, and women's sexual and reproductive health rights are adequately and appropriately addressed. And at the same time, organizations are working hard in Canada towards addressing HIV and gender-based violence among different populations of women, Aboriginal women, trans women, newcomers to Canada, sex workers, for example, and to addressing the policy environments that impact these women. We all know that gender-based violence is a persistent and pervasive form of human rights abuse, and it's a reality for many women across the world and here in Canada. And as we know, gender-based violence increases vulnerability to HIV, and women living with HIV face an increased risk of experiencing gender-based violence. There's some funny noise, so if you're not already on mute, please press star 6 to mute your line. Through this webinar, we hope to highlight these links and to explore some case studies of the policy environments that have an impact on women's vulnerability to HIV and gender-based violence. There are many lessons learned through these particular case studies that can shed light on the experiences of HIV and gender-based violence of other populations of women, and there are no doubt many more conversations to be had about HIV and gender-based violence in the policy environment that impact these populations of women. And we hope that in the discussion that follows the presentation, that those of you working with other groups of women who are living with and at risk of HIV will be able to share your own experiences as well. We also hope that for those who focus their work internationally, some of the experiences of women in Canada and service providers in Canada can shed some light on the work that you do overseas. And we had hoped to hear from our Zimbabwean colleague to inform the work that's being done overseas, and also to inform the work being done in Canada, particularly with women arriving from different policy environments. And like I said, we will try to get a recording of her presentation so that we can share that with all of you. It's unfortunate that she wasn't able to join us this morning. And with that, I will introduce our two speakers and hand it over to them. Perhaps we can take a few minutes between presentations to check for any clarifying questions, and then leave the discussion questions. We'll have lots of time after the presentations for discussion. Our first speaker is Akan-Essien, a Community Development Coordinator with the AIDS Committee of Ottawa, and is passionate about people and strong communities. She has been working both as an ally and an advocate in the HIV/AIDS sector since 1999. She believes that a strong and empowered female is fundamental for the growth and stability of any community. She therefore believes that educating and empowering girls is the investment to make. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. And Stéphanie Claivaz-Loranger is a Senior Policy Analyst at the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, where she works on HIV-related human rights issues concerning sex work, prisons, and immigration. Previously, Stéphanie was responsible for the human rights program at COCSIDA, the coalition of Quebec's HIV/AIDS community-based organizations. An international consultant, she also helped develop Morocco's first HIV/AIDS and human rights strategy with a focus on key populations, sex workers, MSM, IDU, and Stéphanie holds a Bachelor of Civil Law and a Bachelor of Law from McGill University. Welcome and thank you, Stéphanie. Now we will pass it over to Eno, and just make sure you press, if you're on mute, Eno, you need to press *6.
Thank you. Thank you. I will apologize because I developed a bit of a cold yesterday. I don't know if it has anything to do with the fluctuating weather, but I do apologize. If you can't hear me, I will try to speak as loud as I can. So I'm really glad to be here and have the opportunity to share this, a few thoughts with you, and especially because today is the day that we know it to be, the International Women's Day. So here are some of the things. If you look at the second slide, this is what we're going to be I'm going to be speaking on, the face of HIV and AIDS in Canada, the new immigration laws, we're going to go through a case study and describe how women become victims of circumstance, and then we'll look at a to-do list together. Sorry, I'm trying not to cough. Now, we have data that shows that Ontario's most at-risk populations include gay and bisexual men, people who use injection drugs, Aboriginal populations, African and Caribbean and Black populations, and women who are represented in the above populations, or those who engage in HIV risk activities with them. This data was presented by Dr. Robert Remus. While I recognize all the populations that are vulnerable, or it's not a word I love, but in any case, who are vulnerable to HIV infections, I'm going to focus mainly on ACB, being African, Caribbean, and Black populations, because the new immigration laws would actually affect that particular community more than all the other ones. The reason being they're mainly newcomers, and most of them are in the process of establishing themselves here in Canada. Now, the very face of HIV, if we look at this data here, if I'll have you just look down where it says HIV endemic, we see that's HIV endemic countries. We see 250 people compared to IDU, which is 30. And the prevalence is 1,968. And that comes to a percentage of 41, which is relatively high for just the one population sector. Now, the next slide shows how HIV and the new infections in women have been steadily increasing since the onset of the epidemic in Ontario. I mean, there's a lot of information that shows that most immigrants, especially from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially, live in Ontario. I think it's about somewhere between 49 and 50-something%, which is huge. But now we look at the prevalence rate of HIV, we can see that it's only been increasing. In 2000, it was at 101. If we come down to 2004, 162, and all the way to 2008, 250. So it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Now, Toronto alone accounts for 55% of new HIV infections in women, and that's by 2008. And this is the data supplied by Public Health Unit. And unfortunately, because, well, it is unfortunate, the next region that's most affected is Ottawa, and the statistics speak for that. Now, it's unfortunate that the HIV epidemic it's really unstable, and it's constantly increasing in women. The incidence and the prevalence estimates show the steady increase of new infections, and overall number of women infected is always increasing. Now, the proportion of women diagnosed with HIV has been relatively constant at 25% for the past 8 years. That alone is quite alarming. And women from HIV endemic countries appear to be acquiring HIV at a significant rate. And we're going to be discussing why the new laws would make it even worse, put women at a greater risk. Now, this is a shift to a more precarious immigration. This is the new trend, and some of the laws, I'm sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze. Now, there's a bill dubbed the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practice Act. It makes it illegal to facilitate or force the underage marriage and would make temporary and permanent residents deportable if they practice polygamy in Canada. There's also new conditions on family sponsorship. One of those conditions I will discuss a little bit later. Restriction on access to permanent residence, shift to criminalize immigrants as bogus refugees, marriage fraudsters, terrorists, and criminal immigrants. An increase in immigration detention and deportations, including families with children. Now, I'm sure that we are all aware that the power balance is stacked in favor of, it's more patriarchal. It's for men. And now for the law to put it on paper and sort of give the power in a more legalized form is really alarming. So I just decided, I put together, this is actually a real story. This is, it's a story of a lady. Her name is Ima. She's actually from Nigeria. Of course, that's not her real name, but anyways, the lady I'm talking about is Nigerian. She had 2 kids. She was sponsored by her husband. And during the process of the sponsorship, it was discovered that she was HIV positive, because what happens, as we know, is that the immigration will require that while she was in Nigeria, she had to go do a full medical exam. And during that process, it was discovered that she was HIV positive. And of course, they contacted her husband and asked him and informed him that his wife was HIV positive, his sons were not, and asked him if he wanted to continue with the sponsorship, of which, well, he accepted. And so you can imagine this woman coming to Canada, knowing that she's HIV positive. I'll back up a little bit and give you a bit more background. Now, she married her husband a year prior to him departing for Canada. So these 2 children she had while in Nigeria. And what this means is that he would come home, be with her, and they would have intimate relations. She would be pregnant, and he would come back to Canada, continue working, and because the sponsorship process takes a while. So during those 4 years, she managed to have 2 children with this man. And she, at the time when she was getting her immigration, when she did her medicals, it was found out that she was pregnant, that she was positive, and he accepted to have her come. Now, arriving in Canada, she has some education, but she has no Canadian experience. Her husband is the one who works. He's the breadwinner. She's staying at home taking care of children. And as we know, moms, of course, there's daycare considerations, not a lot of money. So her husband is the one who was taking care of everyone, meaning her and the kids. Basically, she's like one of the kids. But in an ideal world, she was contributing in that manner. The funny thing was her husband told her not to take medication because that would prove that she was not only unfaithful to him, but that she brought the curse on their family. And to prove her innocence, and because he was trying to get her to ignore the fact of her HIV diagnosis by some kind of spiritual weird thing. In any case, she wasn't taking medication because he wouldn't allow her to have access to medication. But she fell sick and ended up in the hospital. She was admitted. Her CD4 was 32. And her husband and the nurses at the hospital actually referred her to they gave her the phone number for the AIDS committee in her region. And bravely enough, she called. This is a woman who had been in Canada for less than 2 years. I think, no, at that time it was probably, 9 months or something. Her CD4 was really low, with the cold, the change. Anyways, a whole bunch of factors. Her CD4 was really, really low. She called the AIDS committee, and we went out to see her. At that time, I was volunteering with them, trying to get to do some community work and things like that. And she was afraid to take medication, and she couldn't, it was a really precarious place that she was, because she was aware. Her husband kept telling her, if you don't do what I say, I will have you deported, you and your children. In fact, I may take your kids from you. He threatened her with everything that was within his power. And to be very honest, this was actually prior to the existing laws now. Now, what we are seeing today is women who really don't even have a voice. Women who are completely, first of all, you arrive in a new country, you're isolated from every form of social support you ever had. You don't know the system. You may or may not know the language or not know enough of it, cannot work. If you have children, you have your child care considerations. So these are multiple layers that women have to navigate just to be able to have adequate care, or even just to wrap their brains around the phenomenon of being in Canada. And then you add the factor of you have to be married to your spouse for 2 years. Now, the law now states that the sponsored partner, in this case I would be Ima, must remain married for a minimum of 2 years in order to authenticate the union and obtain their resident permit. And if there's abuse, the onus is on the victim to prove hardship. And we can imagine how easy it would be to prove hardship while you're trying to take care of your kids. You don't quite know where to go. Your husband, the person that brought you here, who is the one who introduces you to this new world, has told you all these things in every way how you are basically a prisoner of your decision to come to this country. I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but I think it's something that's worth looking at, that these are real people whose lives are being impacted really negatively. Imagine a woman living with the idea of knowing when coming to Canada, you're thinking it's a new lease on life for your children. First of all, you're going to reunite your family. You're going to be with your husband. You're going to be able to, build a new life in a new place. And here you are facing so many limitations, so many different issues that make life right from the get-go completely distasteful for you. So I think these are some of the things that we could consider when we're trying to figure out a way to help people like this in this particular situation. I don't like the word cultural competency because I don't know that it's really within human capacities to be fully competent in every single culture that exists, because even in our Canadian culture there is subcultures, as is with everywhere else. But I think as human beings we're able to appreciate honesty. And as adults, we don't, even as I have children, my children know that I don't always have the answers because I know my own limitations. So I think when we're approaching this kind of situation, the first thing to do is assess our own limitations. Know that you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know. Encourage the person to assess her own limitations. Know, okay, what is possible for you? What can you do? Again, I really don't believe that the first response is always leave him, run away, he's a monster. That might be our own personal assessment, but everybody in a situation needs to be able to be given a full picture of, if you do this, this is what will happen. And I think it's important to start building a relationship with trust, to encourage comfort and trust on the part of the person that we're trying to help. We definitely do not have to do all things or to know all things, but we must get allies and resources involved. In this particular case, a place like HALCO would be very helpful. They've been a great resource in helping with cases like this. And it's important to help people to make sound decisions according to their own understanding. Because at the end of the day, the decisions we make, we are the ones who have to live with them. Our children, and in this particular case involving children, it's really difficult for a parent to know that their decision could adversely affect their children. So these are some of the thoughts that I have, and we'll be happy to discuss a little bit. Stéphanie.
Thank you so much, Ina. That was an excellent presentation and so informative. There's just a question on the chat function asking you to define HALCO.
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's a legal clinic that caters particularly to HIV positive people living with HIV in Ontario.
Thank you.
Yes.
And at this time, are there any other sort of questions of clarification? You can press *6 unmute if you have a question for Ino, and then after Stéphanie's presentation, we'll launch into some more discussion. So we'll let Ino go have a drink of water.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Uno. And
No problem.
Stephanie, we're just setting up your slides, and then we will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Am I still on mute? This is Stephanie, or can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, good, thank you. So hi everyone. Actually, same as Eno, I woke up this morning with a very bad sore throat. So I've just taken a spoonful of honey. I should be fine for going through it and not coughing, but I'm also sorry if my voice is a little bit off this morning. So I'm going to be talking about the new criminal provisions in Canada relating to sex work that were enacted very recently in December. And I'm going to be I'm going to specifically be talking about the impact that this is going to have on sex workers, which are not uniquely female in Canada, but that are in most part female, and on their vulnerability to HIV. So, every human being has a right to security. This is a human right that has been recognized as early as 1948 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was enacted by the international community further to the Second World War. The right to security is right up there in one of the first articles of the Declaration. It's Article 3, states that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And this right to security of the person has also later on be incorporated in our Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is part of our Canadian Constitution. And Article 7 of the Charter reads that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So about 5 years ago, 3 women, one sex worker and 2 former sex workers, decided to challenge some provision of our criminal code based on the fact that they violated the right to security of the person of sex workers. And this is what started the Bedford Case. Which probably everybody has heard of. The Bedford Case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada was asked to study the three provision of the criminal code that had been challenged in this in the proceedings. And last year, in December 2013, so just a bit more than a year ago, the Supreme Canada found that the three concerned provision of the criminal code were actually unconstitutional because they did violate the right of sex workers to secure. So basically, the 3 complainants had won their case. So what are the 3 provisions that were declared unconstitutional? So first of all, the provision of communication, which prohibited clients and sex workers from communicating in a public place for the purpose of prostitution. And why was this declared unconstitutional? The Supreme Court found that based on all the very numerous evidence that was presented to the court, the Supreme Court found that the communicating is an essential tool for sex workers to ensure or enhance their safety. I'll use the example of a street-based sex worker. So imagine as it was before, both the clients and the sex worker are exposed to prosecution if they're speaking in a public place about prostitution. So what happens? The client is going to want to get out of view as soon as possible. So you can have the client, slowing down his car, expecting the sex worker to hop in the car as soon as possible. He could actually just slow down the car, point towards a back alley, meet up with the sex worker there, get her to quickly hop in the car. Well, it's extremely important for sex workers to have time to screen their clients, to have a look at the person, to have a look inside the see if anything looks suspicious, to ask a fellow sex worker to maybe note down the license plate of the person, to look at the person in the car and to compare it with descriptions of bad clients that sex workers keep. They're often called like bad date lists. So there's many measures that sex workers can be taken, often pretty simple, that have a definite impact on their safety. And the prohibition on communication was found to limit the ability of sex workers to take these measures. So it was declared unconstitutional. The second one was the prohibition on common body health. So once again, based on all of the evidence, it was found that it's a lot safer for sex workers to be working indoors and potentially be able that way to work collectively rather than working outdoors. So the prohibition on common body health was found also to be unconstitutional. And so was the prohibition on living on the avails, so on the earnings of sex work, which is a prohibition that prevents people other than sex workers from living out of money made from sex work. And while originally this prohibition was planned to prevent situation of abuse, it was found to be overbroad because it was actually covering anyone that, any third parties that sex workers might be working with, including people who might actually help to enhance their safety, such as bodyguard or drivers. It could also include any third parties really, such as receptionists or anybody who would be involved in the sex trade industry. So all these provisions were found to be unconstitutional. Now, what could the government do? So the Supreme Court stayed the declaration of unconstitutionality for a year, which meant that these provisions continued to be valid until December of last year, so December 2014. And then the government had the choice to either leave it at that and those three provisions would no longer exist. And then other provisions of the criminal code could still have been applied to a situation where there was exploitation or violence towards sex workers. The provision about procuring had not been challenged in the Bedford case and remained valid. Procuring is the act to encourage someone to sell their sexual services. Offenses relating to sex work by a person under 18 remain in the criminal code, trafficking in person also, as well as many other provisions generally relating to violence and exploitation. So for instance, uttering threats, extortion, bodily harm, robbery, sexual assault, criminal harassment. These are all provisions, general provisions of the criminal code that can also be used when in context of violence or harassment towards sex workers. And the other option of the government was to actually pass a new law to address some of the topics that have been covered by the Supreme Court, and this is what they've decided to do. So I have a table here that's very much a small summary because it's a lot more complicated than this, but I've tried to summarize it of what was prohibited in the old law and what is now prohibited in the new law. So the main, a very central part of the new law is the first point on the right-hand side, is that the new law prohibits the purchase of sexual services. This is something new in Canada. It's, the government has decided to take this approach that is often called the Nordic Model, which was first enacted in Sweden. That is based on the premise that exploitation is inherent to prostitution, and the purpose of this approach is to go after clients, to criminalize clients. So now in Canada, the purchase of sexual services in any circumstances, whether there's exploitation and violence behind it, or whether there is no violence, no exploitation, and it's between two consensual adults, the purchase of sexual services is now criminal. The second point that was touched upon by this, well, very much touched upon, targeted by this new law, is the communication piece. So previously, we had that sex workers and clients could not communicate in a public place. The communication, the prohibition of communication by clients has actually been broadened. It went from being only prohibited in public places to being prohibited anywhere and at any time. So for a client to communicate for the purpose of purchasing sex work is now always criminal. And so if you think of the example I was talking about earlier about, client being stressed and screening and negotiating of transactions having to take place quickly because both the client and the sex worker were at risk of prosecution. Well, if you think of it now, the prohibition against communication exists and is even broader for clients. So these same effects the same situation is going to be happening, basically. With respect to sex worker, the prohibition has been narrowed a little bit. However, if their clients are stressed and rushed, this is not going to change the sort of interaction that is going to happen when negotiating the sexual transaction, even if the sex worker would not be at risk of prosecution. The clients will still be. And for sex workers, there's also some ambiguities because they could be at risk of prosecution if the communication takes place next to school grounds, playgrounds, and daycare center. Not clear what next to means, not clear what a playground is. Is it a park? Does there have to be installations for kids for it to be a playground? What about daycare centers that are not identifiable from the street because they're inside bigger buildings? So there's going to be a lot of police discretion there on when to arrest sex workers and not, which could create ambiguity and also have sex workers being afraid of prosecution. So, likely to create all the same impacts of transactions having to be rushed. Living on the Level of Prostitution was declared unconstitutional, and it has actually been replaced by a very similar provision, somewhat narrower, but not much. It's instead of being called living on the avail of prostitution, it's now called receiving a material benefit from prostitution. In essence, it's very much the same thing. The new provision is extremely complicated. I will not get into details, but basically, third parties working with sex workers are very likely to still be at risk of being prosecuted, especially that the new provision specifically targets anything that takes place in a commercial context. So for sure, third parties who are involved with sex workers in a commercial context, so in running an agency or a massage parlor, or whether they're running it or they're just involved in it and employees of it, will be at risk of prosecution. So again, people who are playing a role in enhancing the safety of sex workers will be at risk of prosecution very much in the way they were under the old law. A new provision under the new law is the prohibition of advertising sexual services, which was not prohibited before. And so one prohibition that hasn't been reproduced is the prohibition against body houses. However, if we look at all of the new prohibitions, purchasing of sexual services is prohibited. Someone can be fined to be a party to this offense if you're considered as having helped or contributed to someone purchasing sexual services. So this provision, so we can imagine that people involved in running a common body house might be at risk of prosecution under this prohibition. There's also, advertising is prohibited. So there's many different provisions here that will make it pretty much impossible to run a common body house. Just the fact that anyone who in a commercial context receives a material benefit from prostitution, so makes any money off of prostitution, will be at risk of prosecution. So no, the prohibition on common law on body house hasn't been reproduced, but when we look at all the other provisions in the law and how they will play together, running, indoor venues are going to be pretty much impossible to operate. So I mentioned that, we're moving towards the Nordic Model, which was first put in place in Sweden. So what about the Swedish experience? There's a law instigating the Nordic Model was first put in place in Sweden in 1999, and it imposed criminal penalties on person who attempted to purchase sexual services, which is one of the new provisions that's included in the recently enacted law in Canada. And in a nutshell, very quickly, there's no evidence in Sweden that the law contributed to reducing sex work or trafficking as it was aimed to, and as it's actually claimed by the government to have done. There has been a positive evaluation of the law by the government, saying that it's working toward its purpose by the Swedish government, but this evaluation has been criticized by many, many different actors for its lack of, for many things, including its lack of scientific rigor, many inconsistencies, and flawed comparison and conclusions. And then on the other hand, research that has been done has actually shown that not only it hasn't reached its objective of reducing sex work, there's actually evidence of other unintentional effects that the law had, such as clients less willing to act as witnesses in case of exploitation of a sex worker because they now fear their own arrest. So they want to stay, as far as possible from being involved in any case. Sex workers are reporting feeling harassed by the police rather than protected, even if under the new law they're not supposed to be a target of prosecution. Sex workers have expressed a fear of increased violence and actually an increase of violence. And street-based sex worker reported less bargaining power and less time to assess clients. So what about in Canada? So in Canada, it's new, this official approach of criminalizing clients. However, previously, clients could still be prosecuted, not for specifically purchasing sex work, but actually for communicating for sex workers. So there has been instances previously in Canada where police, often with the intention of actually protecting sex workers, have decided to target their policing efforts on clients, and for some periods of time really focused on client sweeps and arresting and prosecuting clients. And what can we learn from these experiences? Did we learn from these experiences? In Vancouver, at one point, police in 2013 did change their policy, went towards clients, made many client sweeps, and some researchers conducted a qualitative study exploring how this new change in the policy of the police shaped sex workers' condition and sexual transactions. And the conclusion that came from it is that the criminalization and policing strategies that targeted clients actually reproduce the same harm of the criminalization of sex work generally, and in particular the vulnerability to violence and HIV, STI infection. I'm running quickly through those examples, but I can provide more information later if anyone's interested. In Montreal and in Ottawa, there was also a time where police focused their efforts on client sweeps, and some organizations, so Stella in Montreal and Power in Ottawa, monitored the impact of these client sweeps. And in a nutshell, they also came to a conclusion that these client sweeps had harmful impact on sex workers' safety and security. In Montreal, it was especially very, very clear instances of violence towards sex workers were counted and monitored, and it's extremely clear the numbers went like they doubled and tripled. The impact of these client sweeps were very clear and drastic. What about the impact on HIV prevention and treatment? So Criminalization of sex work negatively impacts HIV prevention and treatment in many different ways. First, it reduces or eliminates the ability for sex workers to negotiate male condom use. The fear of arrest and police harassment drives sex workers underground, forcing them to work in more risky environments, and as I explained earlier, depriving them from the ability to properly screen clients and to also properly negotiate the terms of the transactions. So this definitely diminishes their power to demand safe sex. It's also very important to note that it's been found through research that physical and sexual abuse by clients and those posing as clients often occurs during condom negotiation. So if we're making, the time to negotiate the terms of the transaction more risky and difficult for sex workers, we're even increasing this risk, basically. Also, what happens is that when when prostitution is illegal and then condom can be used as an evidence to prove that there has been prostitution, sex workers are less likely to carry them on themselves. And in Sweden, for instance, where the sex workers are not supposed to be the target of prosecution, but only clients, sex workers have still reported having had their belongings searched by the police for condoms. Conversely, supportive venue-based policies or managerial practices of sex work establishments, such as client sign-in, removal of violent clients, have been associated in research with increased condom use. Another impact of criminalization is that it jeopardizes the access to HIV services. So if sex work is criminalized, of course, sex workers are prevented from talking about their experience to healthcare providers. They'll have a tendency to want to hide the work that they're doing. They will fear discrimination, open hostility, patronizing attitude, and that's going to affect their willingness to access services. And it's a fear, but it's often a fear that's based on very, true and past experience of those instances of negative attitudes happening to them. The Global Network of Sex Worker Project reports that sex worker, other examples of things that happen is that sex workers are pressured into leaving the sex industry by the healthcare providers. They're asked irrelevant questions about their work to satisfy the curiosity of the workers, and they're sometimes just simply denied services unless they exit the industry. And finally, criminalization of sex work enables the perpetration of physical and sexual violence against sex workers. The abuse is fueled by the knowledge that sex workers don't have access to legal remedy when there's abuse, right? So this creates a sort of climate of impunity. It gives basically license to police and non-state actors, so clients and people posing as clients, to abuse sex workers because they know that the sex worker will not have access to justice, won't have any recourse if violence occurs. And then, this also means that much of the violence actually goes unreported because sex workers will fear of not being taken care of seriously if they go to the police, or they will, very simply fear their own arrest. So I'm almost done here. And I find, so there's something very compelling that was published in the Lancet recently. So the Lancet had an edition specifically dedicated to HIV and sex work, and one of the articles in it included a modeling. So it's a study that was done in Vancouver, and they developed a modeling which came to the conclusion that nearly 39% of HIV infections could be averted among female sex workers and their clients in the next decade by decriminalization of sex work in Vancouver. And how would that happen is the positive impact that decriminalization would have on violence and police harassment, and on increasing the safe work environment and the condom use. So what are the next steps? Very quickly, in a nutshell, sex worker groups and their allies will and are working together to ask provincial governments not to enforce the new law, to monitor the consequences of the enforcement, and to challenge the new law before the courts. So I'm sorry I took a bit longer than I was supposed to. I still have many things to say, so if you'd like more details on some of the things that I've mentioned, I'd be happy to be providing some. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a really excellent overview of a very complicated topic and helped clarify a lot of things for me, and I hope for others on the line as well. At this point, I'll just say again for those who joined a little bit late that we aren't able to have our third speaker, Neti from Zimbabwe, join us today as she was called away on some urgent work and is not able to connect from where she is. So we hope to be able to get a recording of her presentation and share that link with all of you at a later date. So thank you again to Eno and Stephanie, and at this point we can open it up for questions and discussion. Please feel free to not only ask questions to the presenters, but we'd love, there's a lot of experience on the line, and we'd love to hear about your own experiences with HIV and gender-based violence and the policy environments that you are working in. And you can press *6 to unmute, and you're also welcome to ask questions in the chat section.
I have a question for Stephanie.
Yes.
Stephanie, it's Eric calling from the AIDS Committee of Durham. Would it be possible to get a copy of your slideshow presentation that you just did?
Sure, definitely. I'd be happy. Maybe I can, well, Shaina has a copy, and I'm happy if she wants to share it with the participants.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. There's another comment to please share the slides. So if it's okay with Eno as well, I can share both sets of slides with all of the participants. Are there any other questions or comments, folks on the line?
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, so this is Alex from PIL/HIV/AIDS Network. I want to find out if sex workers can advertise their own services in newspapers.
Okay, so under the new law, the law states that advertisement is illegal. However, there's another section in the law that indicates that sort of provides an immunity to sex workers. So basically, a sex worker cannot be prosecuted for her or his advertisement of her or his own sexual services. However, it seems like anybody else who's involved in the advertisement of it, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's the internet host, like I'm not super good with internet and technology, but like the server hosting the advertisement, pretty much would be at risk of prosecution. So the sex worker, in a way, can advertise. It's not illegal for her or her to do so, but how will you do so if any means that you're using will be at risk of prosecution? So it's like the new law is probably going to make it very complicated for sex workers to advertise. And actually, I just want to add that the issue by that's actually been raised by many sex worker groups is that advertising for them is a means of communication, of starting a communication dialogue with their client, and it's a safe way to do so. And if sex workers can no longer use advertisement, what are their options that are left? So, many more sex workers could end up in the street, which is also a form of advertising and communicating. But, it has been recognized by the Supreme Court that working in the street is actually putting sex workers more at risk of violence.
Right, thank you. I have one or two more questions. Can I do that?
Sure, go ahead with the next.
All right, so the other question I have is the new law seems to have shifted the focus from penalizing sex workers themselves to the client. But it looks like it is not different from the old one because it still criminalizes sex work. Mm-hmm. So if there are examples elsewhere where an environment is created for sex workers to work in a very fair and protective environment, how does it look like, and why is it so difficult for Canada to adopt such systems?
Mm-hmm. There are examples of places where it's been done differently. I would say that the example that I hear from sex worker groups, internationally and from the concerned country that are the most satisfied with the situation is New Zealand, where in New Zealand sex work has been completely decriminalized, and Catherine Haley is international sex workers activist from New Zealand, and she's been, going around and making presentations and explaining the impact that has had on sex workers, making them feel safer, making them feel more empowered because they, for once, are recognized the rights that other person are recognized and which sex workers are usually deprived of. There's been examples recently. It was in the newspaper recently, cases of the owner of an agency in New Zealand that was found liable for criminal harassment for harassment, not under criminal law, but for harassment in the workplace toward a sex worker, and had to provide compensation. The sex workers was compensated for it. These are things that are not, possible under regime of criminalization. So that's the example I can think of. Definitely, what we're advocating here in Canada, the legal network with supporting the sex worker groups who are actually the ones asking for it, is decriminalization. And why is this difficult to reach in Canada? Probably many different answers to this. What is a bit ironic is that we seem to be at a time where that's what's being reported by sex workers, and I think is good, and we can be optimistic about that, is sex workers are saying that it feels like in their battle for decriminalization and their battle for their rights, they feel like for the first time they're having a support from the general population, which they've never used to have before and always had to be fighting on their own. So it seems like, the population is more and more divided on the issue, and more people are starting to recognize that decriminalization is the way that we need to be going. However, we have a government right now that's ruling on ideology, and very clear evidence was provided to the Supreme Court of the impact of these criminal provisions on violence and on the safety of sex workers. And our government, came back with a law that pretty much reproduces the same type of prohibition that the old law did, and even increase the level of criminalization. So it's, I think the fact that we have a government ruling on ideology rather than evidence is one of the main problems.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have a couple of questions in the chat function. One of the questions is about, do we know how the new laws are being enforced so far? And the other question is, says, Stephanie, I appreciate your comment that we sometimes ask irrelevant questions to sex workers to satisfy our own curiosity. I wonder what types of questions or studies are most useful to be doing with people engaged in sex work within this political climate.
Sure. So I will start with the question about implementation. So we have started to hear about prosecution that were laid under the new law, but I would say not many until now. Most of the charges I've heard of are of human trafficking or involving minors, but those and those provision on these topics are the same as they were in the criminal code. They were just included in the new law because sometimes some very small modification was made in the drafting of the article, but really these prohibition, as I was talking about earlier, were not affected by the decision of the Supreme Court. So, but they're still being reported as taking place under the new law. So those are the few that I've heard of in Ontario right now. So we haven't seen cases yet of agency owners being prosecuted or clients being prosecuted for the purchase of sex work. And it might be happening. We're on the lookout to see how the law is going to be implemented. I think the problem is that the way it's going to be implemented is going to vary from one province to another, from one region to another, from one district to another, really depending on what's the strategy of the police in that area. And some police departments, such as in Vancouver, have, made statement to say that they're not going to change their policing practices because of this new law, and they're going to remain focused on safety of sex workers. So it's going to vary throughout the country. What we are currently trying to do, I don't know if some of you might have heard that the Premier in Ontario has actually expressed concern on the impact of the new law and has asked the Attorney General of Ontario to study the law and to render an opinion on its constitutionality. And what we've been militating for, what the sex worker groups in Ontario have been militating for, and that the Legal Network has been supporting, is to ask the Attorney General to actually not be implementing the law while it's being studied, because if we're having concern, if even the government is having concern with this law, that it puts sex workers at risk, the law currently shouldn't be implemented. But right now, it is being implemented. There hasn't been any guideline to police or prosecutors to say that they shouldn't be implementing the law. So it's really going to be key when the Attorney General of Ontario is going to render her opinion on the law. That's going to be a very key moment, and if it's an opinion based on evidence, which would raise question as to the constitutionality of the law, this could be used, as a tool to push further for a challenge of the law or non-enforcement of the law. So that's what's currently being monitored and what we're working on. And the other question is, Stéphanie, I appreciate your comment that we sometimes ask irrelevant questions to sex workers to satisfy our own curiosity. I wonder what types of questions or studies are more useful to be doing with people engaged in sex work within this political climate. On the calls that I've been participating with sex workers groups, and some researchers, I think that for now everybody is definitely worried about the instances of violence that will be happening. I definitely think this is something that is going to be being monitored, and there's mostly going to be studies on this. I would expect to see studies also on the impact of the law on different groups of sex workers. There's so many there's street-based sex workers, there are workers who are working indoors, some are working, we're working through their home or via services on internet, which might become more difficult, which will become more difficult. But there's also, there's subpopulations of sex workers, trans sex workers from different ethnic communities, male sex workers. So I'm thinking probably there will be studies hopefully on the impact that, many different groups of sex workers can be object of because of the law. So I'd say this is what I've been hearing about. I'm not a researcher myself, so these are my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Stephanie, we have a comment from the Pickering Welcome Center on the chat function saying that body rub parlors are getting around the advertising restriction through rubmat.ca, a website which provides reviews of body rub parlors, and often comments about sexual transactions are included in these reviews. But these are not on the parlor's own website, so it doesn't constitute advertising. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, there are different ways that people have been talking about getting around the advertisement prohibition. Something else that I've heard is some sex workers have been mentioning, that they can use services providers from the States rather than in Canada. but really the way that the prohibition on advertisement is going to be implemented and question of jurisdiction. So on this example, will the courts consider that they have jurisdiction to prosecute internet service provider in another country than here, or in the example that you're giving, it would be a interpretation of the law to see, does this fit the definition of advertisement, even if it's not on the website of the rub parlors? Maybe not. It really depends on how it's going to be interpreted in court. So how to get around the prohibition is definitely something that's being discussed. Hard to tell how the law is going to be applied, though, because we don't have any previous example, as this is a complete new prohibition.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments, or anybody want to share their own experiences from their own work? There are just a couple people who are currently typing something in the chat function, so we'll just wait for those questions if nobody has a question on the phone. The question on chat is, I'd love to hear more about what service providers can do in terms of policy or practices.
It's not my specialty, as I am working as an advocate on the law itself. Like what I've come across with respect to service providers is the how it can be a limit to the access to HIV services by sex workers when service providers don't have a full understanding of what work sex workers do and the issues that they're facing. So, I mean, a first step, I think, would be, as a service provider, if you're working with sex workers or know of other service providers who are working with sex workers, is to make sure to have a good understanding of what sex work is and the issues that sex workers are facing. There's a great website. It's the Canadian Alliance for Sex Law Reform. Let me just, Canadian Alliance for Sex Law Reform. Well, I'll double check it while we're continuing the discussions. That have many tools that have been developed for just information. There's great documents that are just informing on the reality of sex work. So I'd say this as a first step. And yeah, but I'm not involved really in the service providing myself, so I feel maybe other people actually who are working with sex workers and as service providers, if anybody wants to jump in the discussion, I'm sure that there's many interesting points that could actually be brought up.
There's one comment on the chat, again from Pickering Welcome Center, saying that the Durham Regional Police report that they are not targeting sex workers, only clients, in response to the uncertainty around the new law. Another point to add to the discussion. Are there any other questions or comments on the phone?
One quick question, maybe for clarification. Are service providers who support victims of violence, are there any barriers to how they can support them under this new law?
Like risks for service providers themselves under the new law?
For example, if you look at the case that Eno presented, if she came for support, is the service provider still in a position to provide support, or because looking at the new law, the service provider cannot provide that support that she may need?
No, there's no problem under the new law for service providers. I think it's more like what they've seen in Sweden is that it's not in terms of a legal risk for service provider, but because of this approach of criminalizing the client and just considering that all prostitution is violence against women, and because the stated goal of the law is to eliminate prostitution, what I've seen reported in studies and that is that some service provider will refuse to be providing services to sex workers because they would consider that would be encouraging sex work. But I'd say that it's more in terms of the law had a sort of effect on perception of sex work by some of the service provider. So, hopefully it's not something that will be happening here. But in terms of legal risks for service providers, what could a service provider be considered as encouraging a person to commit sex work? This offense, the offense of procuring, so to encourage someone to be involved in sex work, was already existing under the old law. It is still in the new law, but we've never heard of instances of service providers being prosecuted or at risk of prosecution for that. And I don't think I wouldn't consider that a real risk. Police across the country, police services across the country have been issuing different messages saying that they will be focusing on certain priorities, and it would be very surprising that it ever becomes a priority for police services to prosecute service providers.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is obviously an area where there are lots of questions and lots of need for more discussion about how this is going to impact sex workers and people working with sex workers. Are there any final questions or comments?
Actually, this is Stephanie. While we were speaking, I did find the website I was thinking of with information on it. So it's the website of the organization Stella in Montreal, and their website is Stella. So Chez is C-H-E-Z, Stella, STELLA.org. The website is both in English and in French. And if you go under the tab Bedford vs. Canada, there's an info sheet option, and there's many interesting info sheets there, including one that's 10 ways to be a great ally to sex workers. So I think that some of the questions that some of the information some of you were looking for on how to support sex workers, I'm sure there's great information that will be included in these info sheets.
Well, thank you. On that note, I think Stephanie probably would like to rest her tired voice, so I will say thank you again so much, Stephanie and Eno, for your presentations. They were both very informative and shed a lot of light on two very important areas of the policy environment for women who are at risk of HIV or living with HIV in Canada. And I think there are a lot more discussions to be had around these policy areas and definitely others. And thank you to all of the participants on the line and for everyone who has been asking questions and having a discussion with us. And I hope that you all have a wonderful day, and we will share the recording link and the slides with you as soon as they're available. Thanks again and have a great day.
Thank you.